The first fine appeared on my front door before sunrise, taped crookedly as if it belonged in a horror movie. $100. Not for noise, not for damage, not for anything illegal, just non-compliance. My stomach sank as I read the tiny print. At that moment, I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about control. HOAs don't stop at one fine. They stack them. Every day you resist, they tighten the noose, and I was suddenly trapped in a game I didn't know how to play. And if you've ever felt powerless in your own home, hit like and subscribe now. Because what happened next completely changed the way I would see HOAs forever. The violation was for my backyard shed, a small wooden structure I had built years ago to store tools and memories, my own little sanctuary. It had been approved, permitted, and completely forgotten until suddenly it was. According to the HOA president, the rules had changed, and now my shed was suddenly illegal. I immediately emailed them, attaching permits, photos, and old approval emails. No reply. The next morning, another notice appeared. Another $100. And the day after that, yet another. It felt intentional, like a trap designed to make me break. I went to the HOA meeting thinking logic would work. I calmly presented every email, every photo, every permit. I expected at least a hint of understanding. Instead, the president barely looked up from her notes. She told me the board had discretion, that the new rules applied retroactively, and whether I agreed or not didn't matter. Her smile was cold, smug, and utterly terrifying. That was when I realized the fines weren't about rules. They were about fear, power, and intimidation. Every morning after that, another notice arrived. My mailbox became a daily countdown, a constant reminder that the board wanted me to break. Friends told me to tear the shed down, pay the fines, and move on. They said it would be cheaper, easier, and less stressful. But something inside me refused. This was my home, my property, my right. If I gave in now, they would just find another excuse tomorrow. I began documenting everything. Every notice, every ignored email, every denied request for a hearing. I sent certified letters, requested formal explanations, and kept meticulous records. I even photographed the fines taped to my door in the early morning light, keeping timestamps and notes about their placement. It was almost ritualistic, but I knew these details could become ammunition if the situation escalated. Then came the letter that changed everything. Continued noncompliance may result in lien proceedings. They weren't bluffing anymore. They were threatening to take my house over a shed I had built with my own hands years ago. Sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of fines and paperwork, I realized a truth most homeowners never understand until it's too late. HOAs don't need to be right. They just need to outlast you. They fine you, pressure you, and hope you give up. That night I realized the solution wasn't confrontation. It wasn't yelling, it wasn't arguing, it wasn't paying. The entity they feared most wasn't me, wasn't a lawyer, and wasn't the courts. It was their insurance company. And I realized that if I carefully documented everything, every notice, every ignored email, every threat, I could turn the system against them. I could make the very organization that had tried to crush me tremble with fear. The next morning, I called the insurance company. I explained the situation in detail, calmly and methodically. The representative listened quietly, jotting down every note. "Sir," she said, "this is a serious policy violation. The HOA is exposing itself to liability. We need full documentation immediately." My heart skipped a beat. The tiny stack of notices and emails I had been obsessively collecting for weeks wasn't just proof, it was leverage. I spent the next several hours compiling everything meticulously. Each daily fine, every ignored email, every rejected request for a hearing, copies of city permits, past approvals, and photos showing the shed's original construction. I organized it into a single, airtight file and sent it to the insurance adjuster. 48 hours later, the first response arrived. A formal notice sent to the HOA board, labeled a potential liability exposure report. The language was precise, professional, and undeniably serious. It stated that if the board continued issuing fines, attempted lien proceedings, or ignored proper documentation, the HOA's insurance coverage could be suspended immediately. Suddenly, the aggressor had become the threatened, and the powerless had found their weapon. By mid-morning, the behavior change was noticeable. Notices stopped appearing on my door. Emails vanished. The board members called an emergency meeting, probably expecting to intimidate me. Instead, the insurance notice had caused panic. Members whispered nervously, flipping through policy documents, questioning each other quietly. By the end of the meeting, the HOA president, once untouchable, was pale, sweating, and silent. The power dynamics had completely flipped. By the next morning, I realized it was time to escalate, but carefully. I called the insurance company. At first, I wasn't sure if they'd take me seriously. Most people only call for accidents, claims, or property damage. But I calmly explained everything: the daily fines, the retroactive rule changes, the ignored emails, and the looming threat of a lien on my home. The representative listened quietly, jotting down every note, and then said something that made my heart skip a beat. "Sir, this is a serious policy violation. The HOA is exposing itself to liability. We need full documentation immediately." In that moment, I realized the tiny stack of notices and emails I had been obsessively collecting for weeks wasn't just proof, it was leverage. I spent hours compiling everything meticulously: every daily fine, every ignored email, every rejected request for a hearing, copies of city permits, past approvals, and photos showing the shed's original construction. I organized it into a single, airtight file and sent it to the insurance adjuster. 48 hours later, the first response arrived: a formal notice sent to the HOA board, labeled a potential liability exposure report. The language was precise, professional, and undeniably serious. It stated that if the board continued issuing fines, attempted lien proceedings, or ignored proper documentation, the HOA's insurance coverage could be suspended immediately. Suddenly, the aggressor had become the threatened, and the powerless had found their weapon. Within hours, the behavior change was noticeable. Notices stopped appearing on my door. Emails vanished. The board members called an emergency meeting, probably expecting to intimidate me. Instead, the insurance notice had caused panic. Members whispered nervously, flipping through policy documents, questioning each other quietly. By the end of the meeting, the HOA president, once untouchable, was pale, sweating, and silent. Their confident, smug facade had completely crumbled. But the HOA wasn't done yet. They tried one last subtle attempt, sending an email claiming that new interpretations of the rules allowed them to fine me further. One board member even came to my door, likely expecting intimidation to work. I calmly invited him inside, poured coffee, and let him speak. Every threat, every implication, every attempt at manipulation, I discreetly recorded. By the next morning, the insurance adjuster had reviewed everything and responded almost with amusement. "One more attempt at daily fines, and coverage will be suspended. They are financially exposed and legally vulnerable." The board's intimidation had become dangerous for them. By midweek, the HOA's behavior had completely changed. Emails and notices stopped, and homeowners began whispering about the unusual silence from the board. The once aggressive, confident HOA was now frozen with uncertainty. Watching from my window, I realized the most important lesson: strategy, documentation, and patience are far more powerful than anger or confrontation. HOAs rely on fear and compliance, but when you know who holds real power, their threats evaporate. Then came their final, desperate attempt. They sent a small team to inspect my property in front of neighbors, hoping intimidation would work in public. I welcomed them calmly, poured coffee, and let them speak, all while discreetly recording everything. Their confident expressions quickly faded as they realized every action was documented, every threat neutralized, and their insurance company had already been notified. What had started as a simple dispute over a shed had transformed into a complete reversal of power. By the time they left, humiliated and silent, I understood a truth most homeowners never grasp: patience, Preparation and knowledge of who holds real authority can dismantle even the most intimidating organizations, and victory doesn't require shouting, it requires strategy. By the end of the week, the fines were frozen, the emails stopped, and my shed remained untouched. The board's confidence was gone, replaced by fear and confusion. Neighbors whispered about the unusual quiet, and for the first time in months I felt safe in my own home. And the best part, I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I didn't lose sleep over their threats. I let preparation, strategy, and knowledge do the work. After the public attempt to intimidate me failed, the HOA seemed to shrink back, but I knew better than to think it was over. They were still plotting, still looking for a loophole, still hoping I would slip up. Every day I checked my mailbox with a mix of anxiety and determination, but nothing came. No fines, no threats, no emails. The silence was almost deafening. It was the kind of calm that feels uneasy, the kind that makes you anticipate the next storm. I spent the time reviewing every rule, every past approval, and every city ordinance I could find, making sure that if they tried anything else, I would be ready. And if you're watching this, hit like and subscribe, because the next Muvas are about to turn the story from a legal battle into a full-on strategy showdown. Then, one morning, a new letter arrived, not addressed to me directly but slipped under my neighbor's door with my name visible in the CC field. It claimed that the HOA could enforce fines retroactively if it determined any historical violations of property maintenance. My stomach sank for a moment, but I had already anticipated this. I calmly photographed the letter, noting the date and time. I saved a copy, printed another, and added it to my growing file of documentation. Every single shred of evidence I had collected became more important now. I realized that by staying organized, patient, and meticulous, I could turn every attempt by the HOA against them. The board members probably thought that subtle intimidation would scare me, that their clever wordings and procedural threats would make me break. But I had discovered something invaluable. They relied on fear, not facts. Their power depended on homeowners not questioning them, not pushing back, and certainly not having proof. I had all of that. I could calmly present it to anyone, the insurance company, a lawyer, or even my neighbors, and it would stand as a testament to their overreach. Every time they thought they were in control, they were actually exposing themselves to more liability. I decided to increase my strategy. I prepared a detailed timeline of every interaction, every notice, every ignored email, and every informal threat. I created visual charts showing the pattern of harassment, showing how the fines had escalated day by day. I included photographs of the shed, the original approval documents, and even witness statements from neighbors who had seen the notices being left. By the time I emailed this to the insurance adjuster, I knew that any further attempt by the HOA would not just fail, they would be risking everything. Sure enough, the very next week, the HOA made a risky move. One of their members approached a neighbor trying to gather informal statements to use against me, likely hoping to claim community complaints. I calmly intercepted the conversation, introduced myself, and politely explained that I had all interactions documented. I suggested they direct any concerns to me formally, in writing. The member left, visibly frustrated. I quickly made notes, added it to my file, and sent a copy to the insurance company. The adjuster responded promptly, stating that any harassment or informal attempt to intimidate would now be flagged as high risk for liability. It was a complete reversal. They were now the ones afraid of consequences. The quiet that followed was almost surreal. The board, once loud and intimidating, now hesitated with every move. Emails stopped. Notices ceased. Homeowners began murmuring among themselves about the unusual calm. For the first time, I felt what victory actually tasted like, not loud, not explosive, but calm, strategic, and unassailable. The lesson was clear. The most powerful weapon against intimidation isn't confrontation, it's preparation, documentation, and patience. Every person watching this should remember: take notes, save evidence, and never underestimate the power of methodical strategy. And the best part, I didn't need to yell, I didn't need to argue, and I certainly didn't need to break a sweat over their threats. I simply let preparation, foresight, and law do the work. By the end of the week, the HOA had completely backed down. Their confidence shattered, their plans exposed, and their threats rendered powerless. And from that day on, my home and my shed were mine, completely untouchable. Proof that careful planning can turn even the most aggressive opposition into a lesson in humility. Just when I thought the storm had passed, the HOA decided to make one final audacious move. They sent a small team to my property, armed with clipboards, cameras, and that familiar smug confidence. Their plan was simple: intimidate me publicly, make me feel small, and force compliance through fear. I watched from the porch as they approached, coffee in hand, a calm smile on my face. For anyone watching this, hit like and subscribe now, because the showdown that followed completely flipped the script on intimidation. As they stepped onto my lawn, I greeted them warmly. "Good morning, can I offer anyone some coffee?" I asked, my tone calm and unshaken. Their expressions faltered. This wasn't the reaction they expected. They began their spiel about non-compliance and potential fines, speaking quickly and with force. Hopping the words alone would intimidate me. I simply nodded, listened carefully, and recorded everything discreetly on my phone. Every gesture, every sentence, every implication went into my growing archive of evidence. The more they spoke, the more exposed they became. One board member tried to raise his voice, accusing me of flaunting rules and undermining community standards. I leaned against the porch rail, sipping coffee, and replied with a calm, measured tone. "I've documented every interaction, every notice, and every requirement. I've sent it to your insurance company, which has reviewed everything. I'm more than happy to answer any formal questions in writing." His face went pale, the smug confidence draining instantly. Their power, which had seemed so absolute, evaporated under the weight of meticulous preparation and law. Then came the moment that truly marked the turning point. Another member suggested taking photographs to report to me further. I smiled politely and said, "Of course, feel free. Everything is public record, and I've got copies for your insurance as well." They began snapping photos, and as they did, I realized the irony. They were now acting as witnesses against themselves. Every step they took, every action they tried, only strengthened my position. It was like watching a carefully choreographed scene in slow motion, where the aggressors became their own undoing. Neighbors peeked from behind their windows, some whispering, some cautiously supportive, all witnessing the unraveling of the once powerful board. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, strategy, and meticulous documentation had turned months of stress into a clear victory. The board members huddled briefly, clearly uncertain, before retreating quietly, leaving my property untouched. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of calm that signals the end of a battle without a single shout. By the end of that day, it was evident: the HOA had lost. Their confidence was shattered, their intimidation tactics nullified, and their overreach fully exposed. I didn't need to yell, argue, or even threaten. I let strategy, patience, and knowledge of the rules do all the work. And as I looked around my property, the shed intact, the lawn untouched, the neighborhood quietly observing, I realized the most important lesson any homeowner can learn. Power doesn't come from threats. It comes from preparation, documentation, and understanding exactly who holds authority. And the best part, I had won without drama, without chaos, and without breaking a single rule. Every attempt the HOA made to control me had failed spectacularly. My home, my property, and my peace of mind were completely mine. And if you're watching this, remember this: document everything, never underestimate the power of law and preparation, and stay calm. Even the most aggressive adversaries can be dismantled without confrontation when you play smart. In the days that followed, the HOA stayed suspiciously quiet. Their sudden silence was deafening, almost as if they had forgotten how to assert control. I continued my routine, tending to my property, maintaining the shed, and enjoying the simple pleasure of knowing I had won, not through confrontation, but through patience, preparation, and meticulous planning. I checked my mailbox each morning with a sense of anticipation that had been replaced by calm. The threats and intimidation were gone, evaporated into the reality of documented truth and legal leverage. Neighbors who had once whispered nervously about the board now greeted me with smiles and admiration. Some even confessed they had been silently rooting for me, inspired by my resilience. It was more than just a personal victory. It was a lesson for the entire community. Watching them come to terms with the HOA's overreach reminded me that courage isn't loud or aggressive. It's consistent, calculated, and backed by knowledge. I had effectively turned the system on its head, and everyone watching could see that methodical strategy always trumps intimidation. One morning, the HOA president herself approached, this time alone. Her confident, smug expression from months before had vanished. She attempted to speak, but I politely held up a hand. "Please, I'm happy to hear your concerns, but everything has already been documented and reviewed by your insurance. I've answered all formal questions in writing." She hesitated, clearly realizing that her usual tactics held no power over me anymore. The final humiliation of recognition settled over her like a heavy cloud. The same woman who once commanded the board with absolute certainty now had nothing to say. From that moment on, my property remained untouched. The shed stood proudly, a symbol of persistence and strategy. The neighborhood had learned something subtle but powerful. Standing your ground doesn't require aggression. It requires preparation, patience, and knowledge of the rules. Every attempt to undermine me had been countered not by emotion, but by methodical action. Every fine, every email, every subtle threat from the HOA had become evidence of their overreach, and every attempt to intimidate me had backfired spectacularly. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized the story wasn't just about a shed, a homeowner, or a stubborn HOA president. It was about power, authority, and the importance of knowing your rights. Many people assume that large organizations, boards, or groups have more influence than the individual, but in reality, their power is fragile. They rely on fear, compliance, and ignorance. When confronted with patience, documentation, and strategy, even the most confident aggressors falter. And here's the most important part I want to leave you with. Victory doesn't require yelling, intimidation, or overreaction. It requires calm, clarity, and preparation. Every homeowner watching this can take these lessons to heart. Keep records, document every interaction, stay informed about rules and laws, and don't allow intimidation to dictate your actions. The moment you realize that knowledge is power, you take control of your own situation. By the time weeks had passed, the HOA had retreated completely. Emails, fines, and threats became a distant memory. I could enjoy my property, my shed, and my neighborhood without fear. Every sunrise felt like a small victory, a confirmation that patience and strategy had won over fear and intimidation. And as I stood on my porch one evening, coffee in hand, watching the quiet calm settle over the community, I smiled, knowing I had rewritten the rules of engagement, not just for myself, but for anyone watching. So if you've ever felt powerless, remember this story. Document everything. Know your rights. Stay calm. Be strategic. And never underestimate the quiet strength of preparation. It doesn't just protect your property, it can completely change the balance of power, turning a situation that feels hopeless into a story of triumph. And if you found this story helpful, inspiring, or just plain satisfying, hit that like button and subscribe. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that strategy always beats intimidation. Because at the end of the day, true power isn't about shouting. It's about knowing exactly how to win without ever losing your calm.